Previously on the Lord of the Rings the card game Retrospective.
Either we heal now as a team.
正しい勝つわ
Right when the Lord of the Rings card game was reaching its peak with the Dream Chaser cycle, the first true competitor to the Lord of the Rings card game was released. And it was another product made by Fantasy Flight Games. That competitor was Arkham Horror, the card game. Another cooperative living card game. This is now the second cooperative living card game to be released. And it was released within the Arkham Horror universe. That's the Lovecraftian universe, which is an open source intellectual property that is used on quite a lot of board games. Board gamers are disproportionately familiar with Lovecraftian horror because it's public IP and I guess anybody could just slap it onto the game. Kind of like Sherlock Holmes. The game shares a lot of DNA with Lord of the Rings card game. For example, every round each player will be drawing an encounter card, just like you do in the Lord of the Rings. You have your heroes, you have resources, you have allies and attachments. You even have a card in the core set called Unexpected Courage. When you play Arkham Horror the card game, you can tell it was designed 5 years later than the Lord of the Rings the card game. A lot of aspects of the game are streamlined. I mentioned before that one of the ways the Lord of the Rings the card game can get a little finicky is with having very large hand sizes. You have a hand size limit built right into Arkham Horror the card game. In the Lord of the Rings, you can have a ton of cards in play. In Arkham Horror, you're limited to one ally, one attachment for each of your hands, etc. I mentioned sale tests and hide tests and other forms of tests in the Lord of the Rings the card game. Those have effectively replaced the quest resolution phase. In fact, you could have actually made Arkham Horror the card game, you could have made it a scenario of Lord of the Rings the card game where you skip the quest resolution step every turn and make your different areas connected in ways almost like in the
Temple of the Deceived.
If you're deciding whether or not to get into Lord of the Rings the card game and Arkham Horror the card game, here's what I would go by. If you prefer one theme over the other, try the game with your preferred theme first. If you want a more thematic narrative experience where you're just taking along for the story, Arkham Horror is designed to be like that. Arkham Horror can only be played in campaign mode. It's not the kind of game where you will try to complete a quest 10 times in a row. If you lose in a quest of Arkham Horror the card game, you move on anyway. In that way, Arkham Horror is much more similar to campaign-style board games, while the Lord of the Rings is much more similar to deck construction card games. Now, if you're saying, wait a second, isn't Arkham Horror also a deck construction style game? It is, but there's a catch. What I just said so far is largely uncontroversial. A lot of people will say Arkham Horror is more thematic and Lord of the Rings is more gamey of a game. But to say that, I think, is to undersell the point. You see, while there is deck construction in Arkham Horror the card game, the fact that you can move on in the quest even when you lose, in fact, the first quest in the core set, you can even resign from the quest before it ends. Like, you don't need to win. It completely undermines the motivation for deck construction. In fact, it starts to feel like cheating after a while, or that you're trying too hard, putting a lot of time to put together an effective Arkham Horror deck to try and make sure you beat a scenario. Part of the fun of it is to lose. Almost feels a little bit like when you jump into a new competitive game with friends and one of your friends chases the meta way harder than everyone else. That's kind of how it feels when someone deck constructs more thoughtfully than everyone else in Arkham Horror. If you're playing it for the story, you don't need to play it to win to the same degree. So if you like the deck construction aspect, Lord of the Rings is the game for you. And that's the majority of the game, and that's where most of the game's depth comes from. But of course, at this time, especially with a lot of board game reviewers, if that's what you're used to, Arkham Horror will be a little bit more similar to that. And as a result, you'll generally see Arkham Horror ranked more highly on board game reviewer lists than you will the Lord of the Rings the card game. But even with this release, the games are sufficiently different that the Arkham Horror card game's release did nothing to precipitate the end of the Lord of the Rings the card game's prime. Around the same time the Arkham Horror card game came out, the Sands of Harad expansion was released. The Sands of Harad and the following Haradrim cycle, of all the expansion cycles in Lord of the Rings the card game, was the most disappointing to not get a repackaged expansion. After sailing the seas in the Dream Chaser cycle, you land in Umbar, which is part of Harad, which is the desert, almost Africa-like area to the south of Lord of the Rings. If you remember from the Lord of the Rings movies, the Mumaks, the giant Oliphants, they're from Harad, and you see a lot of those in this cycle. Side quests are back in this cycle. Archery is back. You meet objective heroes that become player cards later on in the cycle, in Khalil, Yaza, Jubair, and Firial. We also see ways that the designers are fine-tuning their mechanics thematically. I mentioned in the Voice of Isengard and Ringmaker cycle the timed mechanic. Well, that's back here for some quests, but it's a temperature mechanic. That is, if it gets too hot, you lose, as opposed to running out of time. Which is the same thing, it's just better. That's one of the cooler enemy cards here in the Black Serpent, which comes up towards the end of the Haradrim cycle. In terms of player cards, you got a new Gimli and a new Legolas. Gimli and Legolas, who actually work together this time, actually calling each other out.
He was twitching.
He was twitching because he's got my axe embedded in his nervous system.
They went very well with 3 Hunter-style decks and anything you may have been trying to do in the Treason of Saruman expansion. You got Khalil, who was, I believe, the only Harad hero. Harad was an archetype that you're able to build full decks around, but you did get a handful of very strong Haradrim allies that you could make at least a good portion of your deck with and use heavily. The Dunedain Ranger Thorindir got bonuses for having completed side quests, which really started to round out the Ranger deck archetype as kind of a bridge between the Dunedain and the Gondor heroes. Hirgan leans a little bit more into traditional Gondorian decks. Fastred built out your Rohan decks. Falco Boffin helps you bring hobbits to the table at a low cost. If you want to use hobbits and you want to avoid using the same 3 or 4 hobbits every time, Falco Boffin's a nice one to roll out there. Falco isn't a strong hero, but allows you to keep your threat very low. And then Quickbeam as a second Ent hero almost got you to the point where you could have a deck where you had 3 Ents as your heroes, which would be kind of cool. The other major contributor to deck building from this cycle was Valor cards. These are cards that you'd see used heavily in the Defenders of Gondor starter deck that got released when the game was relaunched in 2022. Powered your team up if your threat was over 40. If actual areas of Middle-earth had threat levels at any given point, Gondor was almost always over 40. You also had song cards to make song decks a little bit stronger, and even some more Bjornings, which we hadn't seen since the first cycle of the game. It was a great cycle, if made only a little bit bittersweet by the fact that it kind of was the beginning of the decline of the game. Dream Chaser did not feel like the game was starting to peter off. The Haradrim cycle, it kind of felt that way. And it's tough to say why. It could have been that it seemed like Harad was a little bit more of a reach than the other deck archetypes. So we were just coming off cycles where you had Dunedain decks, which fit right into the lore. Noldor, of course, we're going to have Noldor decks. Haradrim decks, okay, don't have as many ideas left. Remember, we don't actually get to know any characters from Harad in the Lord of the Rings movies. Does that mean we're out of the prime? In fact, the designers still had a few tricks up their sleeve. The Gen Con and Fellowship expansions, now we just had one expansion each year, and it was just relabeled for each convention. In 2016, we had the Siege of Anuminas, and in 2017, the Attack on Dol Guldur. These quests deployed epic multiplayer mode. That's where you could play with more than just 4 players. The Siege of Anuminas could be played with up to 12 players in a game, so you had 3 groups of 4 working on quests at the same time. The Attack on Dol Guldur took that even to another level with a very difficult quest, which is infamous for having, I think nobody was able to beat it that played it when it was released at Gen Con in 2017. So if you're able to beat that quest, much less with a group of 8 or more friends, good job. Instead of being one of the expansions that would add to the game from a story angle, such as with the Old Forest and the Fog on the Barrow Downs, these expansions were the testing grounds for mechanics that were used in the Lord of the Rings saga later. The first of the Return of the King boxes actually came out a little bit earlier in 2016 with the Flame of the West. The Flame of the West was the Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli and Gandalf and really everyone else but Frodo and Sam part of the Return of the King. First with the Passing of the Grey Company quest, where you go recruit your army of the dead. Then with the Siege of Gondor and the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Honestly, the main thing I want to highlight for these quests, we know how the story goes, but the artwork on some of these cards, the Witch King card, for example, look at that. You have that floating crown on kind of a little flame thing. That's right out of the books. They did a great job with that. That's actually one area that the movie was a little bit different from the books, is how the Witch King was portrayed in the Battle of Pelennor Fields. Aragorn is, of course, the Fellowship hero for this deck, but you also got a handful of key heroes and key allies. Eowyn gets perhaps the most thematic ability in the history of the game, where once per game, you were able to add 9 to her attack value. By using her and Merry together, you can take out the Witch King just like in Return of the King. This is the second Eowyn card in the history of the game, and It was a good fit. And another option for Baragon with a strong defense number. We also got some big allies such as Prince Imrahil. Prince Imrahil, just to go back to last video here, Prince Imrahil is the ultimate ally card to pair with Caldara because Prince Imrahil becomes a hero as soon as a hero enters your discard pile. Caldara's ability is to discard her and then bring other strong allies into play. Well, if Prince Imrahil is one of those allies, you've effectively swapped a hero for a hero and gotten an ally for free. The ally version of Halbrad's also key for Dunedain decks because it allows you to control which enemies are engaged with you and not just force yourself to be exposed to open threats. Now we know while the Flame of the West is going on, you have the Mountain of Fire. The Mountain of Fire was released towards the end of 2017, actually in October of 2017. You follow first Frodo and Sam through Mordor with the Tower of Cirith Ungol. Then you have the Black Gate opens and Mount Doom. And with them, the ultimate climax, not only the saga expansions of Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings, the card game, as a game. If you recall from the Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, Aragorn and the survivors from the victory at Pelennor Fields would attack the Black Gate as a diversion to allow Frodo and Sam to destroy the ring and climb Mount Doom, and to direct Sauron's eye. In this expansion, you run those quests concurrently in epic multiplayer mode, which again already got a test run with the Gen Con and Fellowship quests, Siege of Innuminos, and Attack on Dol Guldur. And the idea here is those running the Black Gate opens just need to survive long enough to allow Frodo and Sam and Gollum to do their thing and destroy the ring in the Mount Doom quest. It's perfect. It's no better way to end a story. And even look, some of the enemies, like things are cranked up to 11 here. This is the first time in history of the game where you have mechanics that allow enemies with threat costs greater than 50. And even if that's not really what it means, 350 make the enemies just feel stronger to someone who's been playing the game for a while.
What we do is if we need that extra push over the cliff, you know what we do?
Put it up to 11.
11, exactly.
The Mouth of Sauron at 99 doesn't mean he's the strongest, but that 99 number, you've been playing this game for years, that hits you. You got the 66th threat, Nazgul of Mordor, 56th threat for Gorgoroth Hill Troll. You know, you're in Mordor with these cards. Look at that. Look at the eye. Look at the lidless eye. How cool is that? The Ring Wraith of Sauron, 88. Yeah, you have the chance to earn Gwai here as a boon to come in and save you, just like in the movie. Gollum is now, here he becomes fully a bad guy. The player cards come with the Mountain of Fire are also some of the stronger allies that you'll see. You got Eladon and Elrond here. So Elrond's sons, they come to help you out. Another Éomer hero. You can take enemies out of the staging area in true Rohan fashion. Interestingly, you also got some hobbits, which, if you thought that there was going to be a Scouring of the Shire quest after this, you might have used them, such as Tom Cotton and Rosie Cotton. I literally just connected for the first time now that Rosie and Tom Cotton have the same last name. Wow. So the Flame of the West and the Mountain of Fire, an excellent ending to a saga that deserved one. But the greater saga of the Lord of the Rings, the card game itself, would not end there. And in fact, this was a time when another competitor to the card game would emerge. Now, this competitor wasn't necessarily another card game. This was a reimplementation, in a way, of the Lord of the Rings, the card game itself. It was the Lord of the Rings adventure card game, or the Lord of the Rings LCG. It kind of depended, I guess, what it was called, depending on where you looked. Some of these titles of games are a little bit questionable. So this was a Steam game that might be a stretch to call it an adaptation of the card game. It was more so an inspired by game, kind of like how some movies are inspired by true events. It was an opportunity for designers to redesign the Lord of the Rings card game, one, in a virtual environment, so you're able to do some things you can't do with the card game, but also streamline areas of the game that they had been dying to streamline for the past 7 years. For example, Caleb Grace, in an interview with Nerd of the Rings, mentioned how they streamlined the resource system in the game, where instead of having each hero have their own resources, the player had resources, and the cards you bought were determined then by the spheres of your heroes. The game was changed in a number of ways like that. Some ways for the better, and some ways for the worse. One of my favorite mechanical changes of the video game compared to the card game is you would have preparation cards, which are like event cards that you play, and then they get triggered later on. This is a really good thing for a video game because you don't have to, the system will remember for you that you played a preparation card. And it also keeps your hand clean, because often that's what you have with all the cards in your hand. They're preparations. You're holding onto that card just in case you might have to use it. But having played the video game, it is definitely different. I probably would have played a lot more of the game if it were a direct implementation of the card game. For example, the game is set up as a bit more of a battle line type of game. Lord of the Rings card game can feel at times like you have questing characters that are kind of driving the bus, and then fighting characters that are in the back of the bus trying to stab zombies out the window or otherwise, which can be a little bit strange, and you could say not that thematic, but it provides the game with a risk management type decision because you first decide what you have to commit to questing, and then you'll find out whether or not you made a good decision or not. With the battle line type format where questing has become almost its own version of attacking, where in one of your turns you could choose to attack an enemy, or you could choose to try and make progress on a location that's lined up with the rest of your enemies, it feels very different. It's more tactical and less strategic. There are more obvious wrong decisions that you can make. There's a most efficient way to go about your actions in a given turn. And in the Lord of the Rings card game, even if it's a little bit more complex how you go about each round, the fact that there isn't a defined right answer all the time is a bit of a relief for the players. The game wasn't overly successful, and part of it might have been because, at least when I was playing the game, I didn't feel like I was playing Lord of the Rings, the card game. I felt like I was playing a Lord of the Rings theming of another game, kind of like Keyforge, I guess. I think a direct implementation of the card game might have been more successful, as it would have tapped into the existing player base and becomes a way to play the game without having to use an unofficial card game simulator. In fact, I probably would be playing the game quite a bit if that's what it was, but alas, it isn't. There are also some artwork changes that were a little bit jarring, and I don't know why they changed the artwork for some of the characters. Bilbo, for example, I don't know why they changed it. But while this game wasn't so successful to take the place of the card game, it was one of the signs the prime of the game was beginning to wind down. 2 months before the release of the video game came the Wilds of Rhovanion, the Lusk expansion, and the beginning thus of the Ered Mithrin cycle. This would go on to be one of the repackaged expansions, so you already know going in that we're talking about a nice set of cards. So this expansion takes place in the wilder lands to the east of the Misty Mountains. So we're talking Dale and Erebor and Mirkwood and some of the regions that were originally touched on in The Hobbit. And if you liked the story of The Hobbit, this will remind you of the story of The Hobbit. There were Nightmare packs released for the Hobbit Saga expansion. Part of me thinks that the designers wanted another go at the Hobbit storyline because you kind of had, you had Mirkwood spiders, you had dragons, you had the same region of Middle-earth. Nonetheless, they did a good job with it. The main theme of the player cards of the Ered Mithrin cycle was Dale, and the Kingdom of Dale's thing was attachments, and getting a lot of armor and attachments on allies, actually. Your heroes were Bran, son of Bane, so that's the second Brand hero, and Bard, son of Bran, not to be confused with Bard the Bowman. This is actually now the great-grandson of Bard the Bowman, because you had Bard, and then Bane, then Brand, and then Bard again. And they both, as you can tell, revolve around attachments. Brand gives bonuses for characters with attachments, and Bard helps you keep attachments in play when players get discarded, so as if you're picking up their gear. Well, this was mostly about Dale. You also dipped into 2 newer archetypes. I would call Bjorning to be a new archetype at this point because of how little cards you had early on in game's history. There was no such thing as a Bjorning deck when you just had the Bjorning Beekeeper and Beorn. We also got the Woodman type, like Haldan here. Look, he's, the brawny man here. And we're still talking about attachments, so Haldan actually does better when locations have attachments, which when you have guarded card types, which you had a few of those here, they actually would go into play guarded by a location or sometimes an enemy. That was actually a mechanic that was in the core set, somewhat underutilized throughout most of the game's history, but comes into play here. Like I said, kind of right out of The Hobbit, you also had now a hero Thranduil card to go with your Sylvan Elves, and another version of Dain Ironfoot, Dain who came in at the end of The Hobbit to help win the Battle of 5 Armies and become King Under the Mountain. You had another Bilbo, and this Bilbo, interestingly, also kept a threat cost of 9, as strange as that was, that the first Bilbo was the only card with a threat cost greater than the sum of their traits. And Radagast. Radagast, who actually came with Radagast's staff, which was an attachment which fit right into the Dale cycle, but allows you to beef up your creature. Radagast is all about creatures, and as a result, kind of goes well with eagles, too. So if you want to play a lot of giant bears, Radagast is the hero for you. Well, that is another example of the design getting super smooth here. We had some more eagles get released here, so you have Eagle of the North. And remember that encounter keyword that we had for some of the Gondorian Rangers? Of course that's going to work with eagles, where they just, like Middle-earth eagles, they show up. What better way to show up than show up through the encounter deck like the Eagle of the North? Another interesting release of 2018 was the limited edition 2-player starter set. This starter set was actually quite different from the original starter set and then the revised starter set. It had some of the cards from the original core set and some that you had seen in other areas of the game, So just looking at heroes, for example, you had Aragorn from the core set and Glorfindel from the core set. You also had Bifur and Nori from back when, every other card was a dwarf. We also had the not yet released heroes, Gildor and Glorian and Thorin Stonehelm. So a bit of spoilers for the final cycle of the game.
Stay out of my personal space.
Limited Edition Star was more of a collector's item than anything else. Although actually, a video on the starter set by Clay Doe, something about that video made me think that I wanted to make YouTube videos myself. So at least I have the starter set to thank for that. I don't know what it was about the video made me think that. It's not a super popular video. He made it look easy. Take with that what you will. The last flavor of print-on-demand expansion we would see is the idea of the customizable quests. So over the last few years here, you saw first the Wizard's Quest in the Woodland Realm, then the Mines of Moria and Escape from Moria. While technically the Mines of Moria and Escape from Khazad-dûm came out in about 2020, I'll still mention them here. If you wanted to be able to play Lord of the Rings card game competitively, this was potentially a chance to do that, where one person could actually be setting up a quest and another player actually trying to play through it. To go back to Lord of the Rings card games video game implementation, that's actually is kind of how it works. They make it so that like Sauron's playing against you. You can also play it yourself by just setting up your own quest and kind of tailoring your own difficulty. If you want more ways to play Lord of the Rings card game, this is a way to do it. You also got to see some artwork come back from early in the game's history. The Nazgul of Dol Guldur from Escape from Dol Guldur, Ungoliant Spawn, the Watcher is back, Durin's Bane is back. Well, Durin's Bane is back for like the 4th time. Durin's Bane might as well have never left. She just made it a hero. It shows up so many times. The final cycle, A Shadow in the East and the Vengeance of Mordor cycle. A Shadow in the East, believe it or not, is not a Game of Thrones book. Those are not coming probably for another 10 years. The new thing with the Shadow in the East and Vengeance of Mordor cycle was enemies with attachments. And this was taking place around the area of Ruin. It's funny. Thematically, this will actually evoke 2022's Rings of Power show. If you look at the enemies here, Feanor are kind of like Adar from Rings of Power, someone who's working on behalf of Sauron. The dark scenery, even the prisoners from the Land of Sorrow. It all kind of seems like it could have been made at the same time as the show. I wonder if this was inspired the show in any way, as this came out 3 years before the show was actually released. We're looking at a lot of last hurrahs here. The final quest of this cycle was the Fortress of Nirn, and that is famously one of the most difficult quests in the game. It had been a while since we had seen a truly difficult quest. Maybe this is the hardest one since the Battle of Carn Dûm, but it was meant to be, because it was meant to be the last one that you had to give a run at. The challenge of the Wainwriters was a bit of a divisive quest. Not because it isn't a good design. It actually may have been the best implementation of racing style designs, as some of the quests throughout Lord of the Rings involved trying to keep up, whether it be in a ship or otherwise, with some sort of encounter card. Well, the challenge of the Wainwriters, you're literally been challenged to a race, like a chariot race. Now, I'm not saying that was a jump the shark moment, but it kind of feels like it. Plus, look at that Wainwriter champion. I can't put my finger on who that looks like. Natalie Dormer, maybe? No, that's the type of thing I think you expect to see in the final cycle of a game. But the game still offered some good additions to Lord of the Rings, the card game, mechanically. The contract cards that you got here were basically challenges on how to build your decks and allowed you to either break rules or get certain benefits if you went against normal deck building tropes. So, for example, the Fellowship contract, which is the first of the contracts you got your hands on, had you trying to get 9 unique characters in play, and if you did, you got a nice benefit. That's really cool. It's a great way to add more variety to your game in a way that doesn't feel forced. The heroes of A Shadow in the East are Leadership Frodo and Ned Stark. No, I'm just kidding. And Smeagol, who actually gets his own hero card with the lowest threat cost of any hero in the game at 3. He does not count as a hobbit, though. He is just Gollum. You have the spoiled heroes from the limited edition starter set, Thorin Stonehelm and Gildor and Glorian. You got another Saruman. Lithiriel is a Gondor/Rohan hero that would be featured in the Riders of Rohan starter deck. And then the last hero of the game, surprising almost nobody, was Spirit Aragorn. We had been waiting on Spirit Aragorn for quite some time, as the 3 other Aragorns were released in the first 5 years of the game's existence. So now here in year 9, finally getting the last Aragorn was a fitting end. How funny would it be, though, if they had instead had, say, 3 Frodos in this series, so it was actually Frodo was the one to get a hero for every sphere, and that would have been funny. And improvements to a wide variety of different decks. Sylvan decks got boosts here. Valor decks. Got the legendary Tom Bombadil ally card. Some more attachments to go with some of the Dale cards. You had more Eagles cards. Williador is back. Remember healing Williador in A Journey to Rosgabel in the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle? Good job healing him. Even if it took you multiple tries to do it, good job. Gwahir was the hero. And one of the cooler cards in the game, Thorongil, which allows you more than one Aragorn. As in, you get to use the card text of 2 different Aragorn cards. Or Frodo, or Prince Imrahil, or any of the other heroes. They got multiple copies throughout the life of the game. You're dealing with the ring a little bit more at the end here. After all, we're talking about Vengeance of Mordor, so we know the ring is going to come into play. So not too much going out on a whimper. It's good cards, but this expansion set did not get a repackage. It was not as popular as Ered Mithrin, or the Dream Chaser, or Angmar Awakened, but it did usher in the end of the prime of Lord of the Rings, the card game. We've covered a lot of ground today, but the story isn't over. In part 6 of our retrospective on Lord of the Rings, the card game, in the final installment of this retrospective, we're going to talk about the end of the game and about the break.
Here we go. Pivot. Pivot.
The break that began in 2020 with the release of The Hunt for the Dreadnought and ended with the release of the revised core set in 2022. We're going to talk about not totally unexpected fan-made expansions, which in that gap of releases or after the final release of the game will be the main way you get new content for this game. We'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of fan-made expansions, and we'll also take a look at that last competitor for the game that may have helped usher in the end of the Lord of the Rings, the card game. But until then, I am Jackson's Warfield, and I'll see you in the next video.